Hello, you join us today for the festival of Pentecost, when we remember the coming of the Holy Spirit upon the disciples as they gathered in Jerusalem. We listen to the familiar words recorded by Luke in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like a blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard them speaking in his own language. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Are not all these men who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it each of us hears them in his own native language?" Parthians, Medes and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, "What does this mean?" Some, however, made fun of them and said they've had too much to drink. Then Peter stood up with 11, raised his voice and addressed the crowd. "Fellow Jews and all you who are in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. These men are not drunk as you suppose. It's only 9 a.m. No, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your young men will see visions, your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. I will show wonders in heaven above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood, before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord, and everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." An email bulletin from my friends at Bloomsbury Central Baptist Church in London this week reminded me of the tradition that the Churches Together group, of which they are part, has a meeting annually at Pentecost for an ecumenical service, rather than the more traditional time of the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity in January. Today, plans are well in hand for their service this evening, which will be led by the Jesuits of Farm Street Roman Catholic Church in Westminster, and I'm sure that though a virtual gathering, it will be no less spirit-filled as they come together to mark this great Christian festival. In an unscripted act of unity, the churches up and down the land 9 weeks ago found ourselves on the wrong side of the locked doors of our buildings, ill-prepared and ill-equipped. We found ourselves out on the streets, or more accurately, isolating in our homes, struggling to understand whether or how we might conclude our Lenten journeys, celebrate Easter, and all that has become part of church life, ministry, mission and administration. I would suggest this experience has been a great leveller, in that from city cathedrals to rural chapels, from the established church to nonconformists, from Quakers to Pentecostal churches, all of us are constrained by the same restrictions, and collectively we will, over the coming weeks, be developing ways in which we can bring ourselves back to life after the lockdown. For many of us, the journey of the recent past has been hard to comprehend, and yet as we've arrived today at Pentecost, we find ourselves as Christian believers longing once again for an outpouring of the Holy Spirit promised by Jesus, the Paraclete, the Comforter, the Advocate, and the Helper. In our familiar Pentecost reading from Acts 2, while some believers understood what was being said by the power of the Holy Spirit, others in the crowd could not comprehend what was happening and argued that the only spirit present was that of an alcoholic nature. Pentecost witnessed God moving in a new dynamic way in the lives of those believers. I wonder whether a similar dynamic move is being shaped through our experiences today. In our longing to return to normal, are we potentially hindering the work of the Spirit? Looking forward to what might become the new normal, are we dismissive as those naysayers in Jerusalem? The Holy Spirit is described as wind and fire in Acts, and John uses the analogy of water. All three of these elements can be unpredictable, disruptive, and hard to control. We're all aware that in some churches there are divergences in expression of worship that seemingly stifle the Spirit, or the unfettered freedom in the Spirit, which brings concerns over excess. Those who experienced what was taking place in Jerusalem were taken aback, despite the prophet Joel and Jesus' predicting the Holy Spirit's arrival. Peter, who preached what was arguably the first sermon, used the scriptures to explain what was taking place. I wonder how good is our knowledge of the Bible when it comes to speaking about our faith. And in terms of reading it, do we tend to ignore those portions that make us uncomfortable or are difficult to understand? What prophecies might be fulfilled in our time? Those who heard the believers speaking in other languages were from every part of the known world of the time. It was a clear sign of the Holy Spirit's unifying power, bringing together people from different backgrounds, cultures, and ethnicities. Pentecost 2020, like Easter 2020 before it, is a very different experience for the Christian church, not just in this country, but in all those countries affected by the coronavirus pandemic. Solidarity Sunday, promoted by BMS World Mission, as you will see on this week's contact sheet, is one way of uniting Baptist Christians. But I believe our experiences with all Christian believers sees us drawn back to the beginnings in that first century, where we have the opportunity, like Peter, to speak into our community with power and authority, drawing on the lessons we have learned about lockdown, so that we can come alongside our families, our friends, our neighbours, our work colleagues, and show the fire of God in His Spirit which burns within us, and despite the lockdown. As a reminder of God's Spirit coming as tongues of fire and the sound of a rushing wind, you will have received in your congregational mailing this week a party blower, a way of reminding us of God's Spirit blown upon us and into our communities, reaching out as tongues of fire and a breath of strong wind. May God's Spirit rest upon you and your homes, our community and our church, this day and always. Amen.